I would go and say artificial intelligence, hands down, is probably one of the biggest changes that could help you as an organization. And I'd go as far as saying, if you are looking to kind of invest more in physical security, try to invest in something that is utilizing AI in some regard. Whether it's facial recognition, computer vision, I do think that is the way of the future, specifically for physical security.
Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei, where we discuss the latest cutting-edge technologies and how they are affecting the security industry. Join us as we explore the latest advancements and discuss how these innovations are shaping the future of security. With Jesse, a skilled recruiter, and Ramin, a seasoned security leader, this is the show where industry expertise meets in-depth discussions.
If this is your first time tuning in and you got interested in what we're going to talk about today, which is the convergence of physical and cybersecurity, and we've got a special guest who I'm going to introduce just in a second here. But our focus is really talking about trends in security, looking at the future. How do we educate? How do we talk about trends with hiring, with technologies? And today we're really excited to have Justin Fier on the show. He's going to talk a lot about the convergence of physical and cyber. And Justin's got a really interesting background. He and I actually met at a conference. I was so impressed with his speaking ability and his technical knowledge that I just said, hey, how can we do some work together? And decided to have him on our podcast. He is the Senior Vice President for Red Team Operations at Darktrace, which I know you won't be talking about Darktrace today in our show, but his background is in intelligence, and I'll let you kind of get into some of your experience, Justin. But first of all, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's dive into it. There is definitely a very interesting convergence now that I don't think, and Justin, you and I were talking about this earlier, and Ramin, that a lot of people haven't really recognized the convergence and the integration between physical and cyber. So walk the audience through a little bit of your background, maybe even just defining some basic terms. And I know we're actually going to see some cool tools that you use in physical security red teaming as well, Justin. So we'll let you take it away with a little intro.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, we met at, I think it was a conference a couple weeks ago. And I also do not fit the typical introvert in our industry. I am up on stage speaking the gospel about all things Darktrace at the time. And one thing I am very passionate about that we talked about is physical security. And it's something that I think is oftentimes overlooked. People don't realize that it is actually part of the red team's mandate. So before we even go into that, we're going to throw a whole bunch of terms at you guys today. So let's take a quick second and kind of define some of those. You've got the red team, you've got the blue team, you've got the purple team, and all of those serve very different functions. We'll go through how all of those kind of work hand in hand. But for me, what I find most interesting is just the lack of understanding in most organizations of physical security. A lot of times organizations don't think about it until it's an afterthought, till something has happened, whether it's corporate espionage or nation state has actually broken into their building. As you did mention earlier, I do come from the intel community, so use your imagination, viewers, as to what that might mean. I will not go into detail of what that is on camera, but I might have some experience in the real world doing this type of work. So let's define that a little bit. Red team, what is our job? Our job is to literally break in. Our job is to be as covert as possible and test the business's processes. And that doesn't mean just the technical processes. That means the business processes, the human element, that means everything. And most of the time, the CEO doesn't even know what we're doing. It is usually only known by a very small group of folks. Now, I mentioned some other teams in there. Our job is to beat the blue team. Red team versus blue team. The blue team are the defenders, and our job is to get in and get out without the blue team spotting us. Now, it's not just a matter of getting in and getting out. Of course, when we submit a final report, we give very detailed how to fix that, our recommendations on what the business could do to make things better. So we don't necessarily take it with pride that we've gotten in, gotten out, because it means the business had some areas to fix. But it is also a great thing if the blue team catches us. What's purple? Now, purple, you've probably heard a lot more because there's been a whole lot more emphasis in the last 2 years on purple. And that's where the red team and the blue team literally sit together in the same room. They come up with an operation. And in many cases, the blue team is sitting there saying, all right, red team, go and do that thing. Let's see if our systems caught it. And there's a little bit more emphasis around that right now because you can do it a lot quicker. It doesn't require as much sign-off and as much planning. And it tends to just be a much more fluid operation. That is your primer on what red team, blue team, and purple teaming is. Now, when it comes to physical, and we'll talk about that later on, I find that most organizations or most viewers don't even realize that physical security is part of the red team's mandate. It is our job to literally pick locks. It is literally our job to try to physically break into the office. I've got friends that will wear a UPS a costume, so to speak, and try to social engineer that front desk person to gain physical access into the office. So it is much more than just getting on the keyboard, throwing some exploits, and trying to break the business processes from a technical perspective. And we'll go into a little bit more detail later on about that.
I'm surprised you didn't say an Amazon driver, right? Because I feel like today, the amount of Amazon drivers I see everywhere is a constant. And maybe it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And like some kind of blue, some kind of vest with casual clothes underneath. I don't even see people asking questions.
I mean, Ramin, that's such a great point because honestly, most of them aren't even employed by Amazon. They're contractors. So it's just someone doing gig work on the side.
Cars, they're just like, there's maybe a vest that says they could be tied to it.
I'm taking notes right now. We're absolutely going to put that to test.
Well, I live in a gated community as well, and it bothers me that like when someone shows up and says, I'm delivering an Amazon package, I don't even get a heads up or are you expecting a package anymore, because that's too much work for someone to do. Too many packages showing up.
Yep, and I mean, that's a great point that, we'll definitely chime on later on when we talk about defense in depth. You could argue, what's the point in living in a gated community if every delivery person is given carte blanche access to come in? The next question would be, I hope that the neighborhood has other things in place once you're past that first layer of defense to hopefully capture if that delivery driver is doing something they're not supposed to be doing. And that's the very same concept that most corporate organizations are not doing or should be thinking about as they're building out their security apparatus.
That's a good point. And let's build up to defense in depth, right? So my first job out of school was actually physical security. So this is a topic that I got really introduced to early in my career and got exposure to understanding, to your point, like defense in depth kind of models there, and then started converting that as I moved towards technology or more information technology. But it was interesting, when I first started this job, I was maybe 21 years old, and one of my biggest jobs at the time was like the Atlanta airport. We were updating a lot of their technologies, and to your point, defense in depth was everything, right? So it wasn't enough to have a badge reader, right, at a door with a mag lock at the door. You also needed a camera on both sides of that door, right? So even if this preventative control you put in place, if someone is able to bypass it, you at least now have these detective controls on both sides, so you can at least capture more data that way, right? So that concept of defense in depth also follows you as you go towards cybersecurity, right? These same principles, right? Preventative and detective controls. I'm curious to see, from 20 years ago when I was doing physical security, where has the technology gone? Just to kind of get an understanding, where is the technology from a physical security perspective today from your point of view? Help us understand that, right?
Well, I mean, it's way beyond just badge readers. Badges, we all know, can be cloned. I mean, shameless plug for my company. Artificial intelligence is absolutely an area that can help in physical security. And that is not being a part of the hype cycle or just throwing out the term AI like every industry is doing out there. I mean, AI was used for facial recognition and computer vision long before some of the other new things that it's being applied to. Now, some of the newer age, I'm saying, security software that's out there are utilizing that. They're doing facial recognition in the office. Imagine if your security system could just read the color of your lanyard and determine that it's a red lanyard, so they're an employee. And we can have a count of how many employees versus non-employees are in the office. All of that is doable now. And so I do think artificial intelligence has definitely upped the game quite a bit. And then also the mediums. We don't need to rely on the badges anymore. Our cell phones can be utilized as that, something we have, something we are, to get us in the door. And so the world has changed in the physical space astronomically. Now, don't get me wrong, I still go into so many office buildings where I can literally clone the badge with my little flipper zero here, and I think to myself, how is this massive skyscraper here in the middle of the city still okay with this technology being utilized down at the turnstiles? You know, I look at the menu of all the different companies that are in here, some of which are pretty big companies, and think to myself, how are you okay with the fact that that building is doing that? And so I oftentimes wonder, is this just the times have not caught up? Folks do not realize how easy it is to get past some of these things, or that technology has still really not caught up with the vast world that we live in. It's unclear at this point. But I would go and say artificial intelligence, hands down, is probably one of the biggest changes that could help you as an organization. And I'd go as far as saying, if you are looking to kind of invest more in physical security, try to invest in something that is utilizing AI in some regard. Whether it's facial recognition, computer vision, I do think that is the way of the future, specifically for physical security.
Do you see the vendors keeping up in this space with where the threats are going, or do you see kind of a gap?
Well, that's a tricky question, because I'll ask both of you. How often do you read in the news about corporate espionage? You don't hear about it often. It happens so frequently, but I don't know this for a fact. My theory is general counsel buries it a lot of the times, or for whatever reason, maybe local law agencies or even federal government is involved, and therefore it cannot be publicized. Again, all hypothesizing, I don't know for a fact, but that is something that I find strange. You don't hear about it as often as it is happening. And so because we're not hearing about it, organizations are not thinking about it as a risk. Now, I'll throw another curveball at you. Everybody was on the zero trust bandwagon a few years ago, still are for that matter. Still, nobody's able to really define what zero trust is. Everyone's got a different definition of it. But let's apply zero trust to physical security. A lot of organizations don't think about it because they inherently trust everybody within the building. Oh, he's got a badge, he must be okay. I disagree with that. I don't trust anybody in the office. Probably trust the people with the badge even least, because they have a badge into the building and a password onto the network. So all the more reason to watch them even more so. So I don't know. I don't know if it's one of those things that boards still just don't want to invest in it because cybersecurity is not a revenue generating thing. It could be that old adage. It's hard to say why it has not caught up. If you look at some of the vendors that are out there, the technology is astounding. I mean, there is some really cool tech out there. I just don't know why it has not gotten as much attention.
I wonder if it's more the type of security for corporations. It's more around like a check the box kind of exercise. I know when I worked at my last corporate job, there's no doubt physical security was important to them, but it was a very specific checklist: cameras, badge reader, locked doors for like your server rooms. That was it, right? So it wasn't really threat modeling beyond that to say, okay, what else do we need? What other risks could this location and unauthorized access introduce? And then how do we mitigate those, right? So it's kind of like to your red teaming exercise. If companies don't do the red team exercise, then it's more of a checklist kind of physical security that they do. It's like we implemented it and we forget about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to point any fingers, but that is the importance of red teaming. Not to shameless plug what I do, but that is the importance. It's our job to highlight the risk to the organization. And sometimes the organization doesn't want to hear about it. Sometimes it costs money to fix these things. But that is our job, to highlight all the things that could be used by an external or an internal threat actor. And another reason why I hope more organizations invest in red teaming, whether they have the resources to have their own internal red teaming staff or hire an external staff to do it for them. It is so important because it covers all aspects of the security lifecycle, including the physical.
And it's important too, because you talked about, before we got on the call, the new complexity that like remote workers and more challenges that has created, right? So that to me screws up your baseline, right? Where if you had a baseline of every day 500 people show up to the office, and one day 600 or one day it's 400, you now have a baseline. But with remote workers, you don't have that kind of baseline, right?
Well, and I'll throw two other curveballs at you. You nailed a great point. We talked about this. It is a controversial argument. Do I call everybody back into the office, or do I allow people to be fully remote, or do I do this hybrid? And I don't think folks realize the security risk of the hybrid. I really think you should kind of take one side or the other, full remote or full back in the office. When you do this hybrid, and by the way, this is just my views, it has nothing to do with my company's views. When you do that hybrid, you bring about that added risk of, I have an entire office space with networking closets, sensitive hardware, open ports on the side of the wall, sometimes no front desk person, a vacant office, so that even when a red teamer comes to do an assessment, we have carte blanche. We have 8 hours to do whatever we want, walk around the office. We don't even need to do it in a covert manner. We can do it as overt as possible because there's literally nobody there. And we can implant the office with all sort of things and nobody's going to know any different because the office is literally sitting empty. And I wonder if many organizations don't necessarily think about that as being a risk because we are trying to appease our workforce. And again, I understand it is a tough argument to be had, and we haven't even scratched the surface, and a lot of businesses are going to be dealing with this for years to come. But it is something we do need to think about with all these empty corporate buildings sitting out there. It is ripe for the taking by nation state and other well-resourced threat actors that know how to bypass a lot of these physical security controls. The other thing I was going to point out is, in the last few weeks, a number of ransomware operators have actually gone around the intermediate access broker or the initial access broker, the IAB. And they've actually started approaching employees with that black bag full of cash. Here's $50,000. I need your credentials because I'm going to attack your organization. Let that sink in for a second. Now, that's not necessarily physical. It could be as well, but that is another element that we need to think about. It is right out of the espionage playbook from the Cold War era days. Literally approaching someone, bumping them, recruiting them, offering them something, exploiting their weaknesses to do something on your behalf. And so, again, if I have an employee that's been coerced to go in and plug that thumb drive in for me by one of these ransomware operators, do I have the things in place to capture that outside of just traditional security stack controls?
Well, that's where zero trust comes in, right? We're talking about most of these cyber attacks come from an insider threat. We've seen that, right? And so it's someone in the inside is compromised. Typically, some type of social engineering is in place, or poor ethics on that person, right? Like you said, there's a certain tipping point for the right person to take a bribe and potentially give that out. But then my question would also be, whose responsibility is this? Is it the owners of these buildings that are being outfitted for companies to enhance that level of security when they're already strapped for cash? We all know that the commercial real estate market's been hit really bad after COVID. So now I think there's who takes responsibility, who invests the money that's necessary for these technologies? I don't know. What are your thoughts on how that could be fixed?
I'll throw another one at you. We saw in the last few weeks, it's taken over all of our LinkedIn feeds, the SolarWinds CISO being held liable for what happened there. Now, you can unpack all the details and read the affidavit, but it opens a whole new world of responsibility in our industry, and it's got a lot of folks kind of a little worried, like, am I liable for X? And the question I have is, who owns physical security? The topic of today's podcast is the convergence of cyber and physical. Does that mean physical security falls under the CISO? Does the CISO have an element? Or, Jesse, you brought up a great point. If that building that's housing 10,000 tenants did not take the extra step to put encrypted badges to get past a $180 device I can purchase off Amazon, are they held negligible in some regard? Because it was all out there, all the signs were out there, all the things were out there for you to do to make it harder for someone to break in. Or is there some clause written in there that says, we are not responsible for everybody past the badge reader into this building. We're responsible for keeping the lights on. So in light of that finding, I think we're going to have a lot more questions. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't even attempt to answer any of them. But I think we're going to have a lot more questions in our industry as to who's responsible for some of these things. And I wonder if you're going to start to see more things actually changing as a result of it, as people start to get a little bit more worried about that.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at how you, just as we get into the physical security, curious to see how you break in to a building. I think a lot of folks out there are going to be like, well, what are some of the things we need to even think about from a security perspective? And what are the tools that are out there from the red teamers or attackers, right, that could be used to compromise my physical security?
So first things first, spoiler alert for everybody watching. It's not difficult to do, and you could literally just watch a few YouTube videos and learn how to do it. So you don't need to be a retired CIA officer or have some sort of spooky background in order to do this. And I think that's the other thing that worries me. The barrier to entry is very low. All of these products are readily available. For the most part, make sure you know your laws, because certain states you cannot travel into the state with them because they are considered illegal to even be in possession of. So make sure you understand that. But all of these things are readily available, some on regular marketplaces. The one thing I'd also stress is every door in almost every building is bypassable. Some of the folks in the red teaming community are the most creative folks in the world, and they have come up with the most creative ways possible. So as I was showing you guys earlier, for me, the idea is to be as covert as possible. So I try to keep a little tiny piece of kit on me so that I can walk in with my briefcase and my suit and look like I don't stand out with a black tactical bag, halo jumping in, breaking in. Remember, you want to be as covert as possible. All of this stuff is pretty simple. Any one of you who's been to DEF CON has gone to the lockpick village and has used the lockpicks. Again, I've got hundreds of lockpicks. I pick about 6 or 7 of the most common ones that I'm going to run into in a corporate environment. And that's the key, corporate environment. Because corporate environments, buildings all use the same things. They use a handful of the same locks. They all use the same file cabinets. And so a lot of it is repeatable. Another tool that I've started using is this little guy. This is called a leashy pick. And what's really cool about this is not only can I pick the lock with this, but I can actually decode it and cut a key in the field. So I can look at what the key would look like in there, and then literally with pliers and these little templates, go back to a bathroom or something like that, or back to my car and cut a key, and then come back and open the door with a key. The other thing we want to think about is a lot of the tactics we try to do are leave low forensics footprint. You don't want to leave a forensics behind. You don't want to show that you were tampering with the lock. Again, it's all about being as covert as possible. So as long as you can get in and get out without marring, scraping things up, try your best. This is the old credit card trick. You'd be surprised at how often sliding this in between the door works. Again, the old credit card trick works like 9 out of 10 times, and I still, to this day, find myself just kind of blown away by the fact that we are still relying on doors to network closets that I can literally get in with a small piece of plastic or a shim. Now, when you want to start talking more technical stuff, I mentioned the Flipper Zero. Anybody watching this has probably heard of a Flipper Zero at this point. It is like the Swiss Army knife. I'll be the first to say it's probably about 70% kind of hijinks and for the lulz, and the other 30% legitimate. And I do use this. I bring it with me because of portability. It's nice and easy and easy to use, but I can literally tap it to a key card, clone the key card, and then go back and emulate that card, and it takes less than 5 seconds. One of the things I'll do on an engagement is literally just walk around the office And if people aren't practicing good badge technique and leave their badge at their desk and go get a printout, I can literally just walk around the office and drop this on badges and collect as many badges as I possibly want, and then go back and emulate that badge and log into the office. Proxmark 3 is this on steroids, so it'll do a whole lot more with the badge cloning and requires a little bit more technical know-how. You have to plug a laptop into it, so not the most covert. There are smaller versions of it, but this is another really nifty trick to kind of get past some of the badges that are there. Let's talk about defense in depth for a sec, because I mentioned before, I can literally walk through most of the viewers' offices today, and I would go as far as say I could probably collect at least a dozen badges just with the Flipper Zero, which you can purchase off of Amazon for under $200. Here's a great question to ask yourself. Does your system alert you when someone has badged in even though they never badged back out? It's just simple logic. Someone is already in, and I saw another badge in while they're still in the office. It's that sort of logic I don't think a lot of companies think about. And it's simple. You don't need artificial intelligence. You don't need any craziness. You just need to look at the logs and apply the logic to it. Did Jesse come through the front door twice without actually leaving? You should always have an exit married with an entry and vice versa. And it's that simple. Did Jesse enter a room? Now, you want to start talking about more historical learning patterns of life. Did Jesse enter a room that he's never entered before? That would be interesting. Why did Jesse badge into a room that Jesse has never badged into before? It might be legitimate. Maybe someone walked him in there. Maybe we were testing something. But as a security team, I would want to investigate that. I'd want to know that. And now you start moving into that anomaly detection, learning patterns of life, something that Darktrace does do, not necessarily in physical space, but learning what is normal for a person's movements throughout an office or their behaviors. And this is things that a lot of the physical security apparatuses out there have the capability of doing. So that is just a small sampling of the tools. Remember, I've got bags full of things, but I'm not going to always show up to a site to do that. I'm going to try to keep my kit as small as possible so that we can kind of blend in with the environment. And so if I can get away with just carrying this little tool wall, that's the best case scenario.
You don't shoot a grappling hook through the ceiling and slide down? That's what everybody did.
No, but that's a great point. How many folks think about those drop ceilings in their offices? If I told you how many network closets I've gone into where we went up and pushed the ceiling tile up and realized that I had access into the neighboring company's office.
Oh my gosh.
It's that simple. And so that's the sort of thing I don't think some businesses think about. Your network closet is one of your most critical assets. And if my neighboring company, I don't even need to worry about my own employees. My neighboring company could have a rogue person over there that just late at night lifts up that ceiling tile and comes on into my network closet. But remember what we said about defense in depth. If I have a camera in there, as Ramin mentioned earlier, cameras on both sides, if I have those things in place, then I'm okay with the drop ceiling. I don't necessarily need to put a concrete wall in between. I put those mitigations in place to lower my risk and accept that risk as a business. So it's not necessarily about fixing everything. It's about accepting the risk and proving that the mitigations you have in place are acceptable for that.
And at the end of the day, it's all investment, right? So it's calculating what's the right investment. Are you analyzing the data, right? Like if you do a red team exercise, there's data there. Are you analyzing and making decisions based on informed information? Well, that sounds like it's the key. Even the example you were mentioning around like the baseline, like it's almost like you need SIM type capabilities for physical security to help you with correlation, with alerting, kind of that logic where, a lot of that stuff is not out of the box, right? From 20 years ago when I worked in physical security, I don't remember a lot of logic around alerting with badging in, badging out. So I don't know where it is today. But
and
you
Ramin,
see more of that AI approach on this person's already badged in, so technically they should be in. So why is there another badge from the outside in?
You've said that magical word data twice now, and you even said it when you referenced your job 20 years ago. That is the key point here, data. We're talking about physical security, but we're also talking about ones and zeros in relation to that. And that is the piece that I think is missing. Data is what drives everything, all the way down to the simple door opening, door closing, badging, badge out. And as you mentioned it, listen, I think all of us agree, most of our clients hate their SIM. Most of them complain about it left and right. They still have to keep it, whether it's for regulatory reasons or whatnot. There's lots of arguments to be had about it. But most of the new security apparatus out there will allow you to actually export that data into your SIM. Why would you not want to bring that into the place? I'd also question if any of the viewers out there are in the insurance industry, is that something that the insurance industry asks for? Like, should you be logging that? Do you need to keep that data for 5 years like we're being told we have to keep other data? I wonder, this goes back into that convergence question. If that data can go into the SIM, is there a requirement to do so? And could it even help us with our insurance premiums, showing we've gone that extra mile to bring that data in and we're keeping X amount of it to prove certain things when the time comes that we have to call you up for a claim?
Even you brought up the point of including the controls around physical security with cybersecurity, right? So imagine your camera system or your badge reader system. Do you have multi-factor to access these? Are you locking down? Are you changing default passwords, right? So similar type of hygiene type of...
Who has access to it?
Applying those to those systems too, because I'll tell you, in my last corporate job, if I'm not mistaken, it was physical or facilities that was managing those systems, not a cyber team, right? So do they have the baselining and the expertise to lock those things down as well?
You know,
so
the other thing...
You've definitely scared the pants off of, I'm sure, anyone that has a physical office. But what would you recommend beyond things that are, well, not even beyond, but things that are accessible to companies? What would you recommend for them to do to mitigate some of these risks?
Well, the first thing is something you just mentioned that I think we should have mentioned earlier, the ownership of it. And I'll go back to my Darktrace days, current and past. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a client's environment, and one of the things we find is compromised security cameras because they're old, antiquated hardware with default passwords set in them, beaconing out to places they definitely should not be beaconing out to. And then we ask the question of who manages this, and you just nailed it on the head, facilities or building engineers. And you kind of scratch your head and wonder, like, they're not going to care about patching. They're not going to care about the very simple cyber hygiene that is ingrained in all of us. And so step one is just figure out the ownership of it. Let's define it once and for all, like who owns it in our organization, and let's figure out, like, are we doing the most we possibly can? And it might mean, are we using a system that's 15 plus years old, and is it time to maybe come up with the times and look at some of these new technologies that are out there? I know that we're in weird economic times, and that's not always the easiest thing to swallow, go out and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on new physical security, especially as you just contradicted yourself, Justin, and said nobody's in the office. So that's a tough one to sell to any organization. But I think, Ramin, what you said really resonated the most is that let's figure out who owns it first. If the building maintenance, if the end building engineers own it, then the simplest approach would be just getting them on board, making them realize that they are a part as much as anything else of the cyber apparatus, and just giving them some guidance. We can't just expect them to think like we do, and we can't expect them to reset their passwords and do all that. The other thing is, and shameless plug for Darktrace, visibility, visibility, visibility. So whether you are using a new age physical security system that probably runs off your TCP IP stack, or one of the older ones that's just some god-awful Wi-Fi or whatever, make sure you have visibility into it. It does you absolutely no good to have 100 of these cameras up if I can just, like we've seen in every James Bond movie, kill the feed before I go into that part of the building and wipe the data in the box. So make sure you have visibility into the entire infrastructure, and make sure there are those physical kind of stopgaps. If you can air gap it, even better. I know that that's kind of irrelevant these days. Air gap doesn't really work, but I'd say visibility is the number one piece of advice I give everybody from a cybersecurity and a physical security standpoint. And then the last thing I'd say is red team. If you can afford it, invest in a red team, work with them, make sure you set the criteria for what you want to test. It doesn't have to be the super squirrely black bag stuff. It could be as simple as a fishing exercise that goes a couple steps further than a traditional just fish. Or it could be the squirrelier black bag stuff. I'll tell you, like, I've done engagements where we've actually worked with a witting person, where the CISO has given them a piece of paper that says you're going to do what they say and your boss can't fire you because you did what we told you to do. And you're going to trigger the following things because we want to make sure the business can capture that. If you can afford to work with a red team, do it. If you have your own red team, engage with them. Make sure they are testing your physical security controls.
And if you can't
What
even
about, like, let's
afford,
say you don't
a red
have
team,
the-
I can only imagine, similar to cybersecurity, an assessment, right? And those could periodically be done too. And your assessment, I don't know if there's any frameworks out there for physical security, but I can only imagine our passwords change on a regular basis for your technology, right? Those cameras, are you using secure protocols? Are you patching these systems, right? So red teaming, I think, is a nice to have if you can afford it, but you can start more simple with just kind of asking questions too, right? And doing that on a periodic basis.
I think even if you had a red team within your organization, it doesn't have to always be they fly out and spend a week on site. Jesse, you and I were talking about this.
Yeah.
You could do a lot of this remotely. Like, you could send them a camera and say, I need detailed pictures of the lock keyways, of all your ingress, egress points. Give me a layout from the building of the actual floor plan. And you could do a really nice physical security assessment without ever stepping foot in the building. That is where our technology has taken us these days. So, we were talking about this earlier. One of the barriers to entry that makes it very difficult is the cost. It is expensive to fly a team out, put them up in a hotel, break into the building, make sure different business units are on board with it, get people to sign off on it. What if you could do it remotely so that it is not as obtrusive, and you could probably cut that cost down? So I do think that's something the industry needs to think about, bringing that barrier to entry down so that you don't have to be a Fortune 500 company to be able to afford an in-house or a third party to do it. And so that's something I do look forward to seeing the industry hopefully pivot in the next few years and doing that a little bit differently.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a fantastic idea. And the technology is there, right? I mean, you can do it with your mechanic. You could take a video of what's going on in your car and go look at and send it to him and be like, oh yeah, this will cost this much money. Like, it's just basic using someone who has the intelligence and the expertise, getting their kind of visual on what's going on, and then providing some advice, some basic advice. I think that what we're talking about is the facilities teams not talking to, let's say, the CISO in an organization at all. Well, let's just fix that. Let's create a little bit more collaboration, a quick assessment, like you said, just to at least get a baseline. Ramin, you mentioned it. And then from there, we start to see some improvements in physical security, which will in turn prevent you from a major cyber attack, because a lot of those probably are coming from a physical security breach.
And if I get the honors of getting invited back, a whole other topic could be counter-espionage playbook. I don't think most organizations have a playbook or know how to handle a counter-espionage. What would your organization do if a nation-state agent approached one of your employees with a briefcase full of money and recruited them? Would your employee know what to do? Would your security apparatus know what to do? Would your lawyers know what to do?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Would that be disaster recovery, business continuity? Which team would handle that?
Again, I just gave you guys a whole other topic for the next podcast.
Very interesting topic. Well, Justin, this has been fantastic. I've learned so much and kind of nerded out with you, and hopefully our audience will have picked up a lot of great ideas, a lot of good questions to start asking, right? That maybe these conversations are just not happening enough. But I love what you're doing. I love how you're promoting that. I see a lot of your posts, and just kind of bringing awareness to these things is so important. I think security, as I've learned it, it's a lot about awareness. Like you said, visibility is everything. Mm-hmm. Awareness is what creates a lot more of your understanding of what you need to look at, right? So thank you for coming on the show. We really enjoyed it. Any last parting thoughts for the audience?
No, just thank both of you for giving me the honor to be with you guys and chat about this, and always happy to nerd out with you. If anybody listening's got any questions, ping me on LinkedIn. If you can't tell, I am a nerd at heart, so would love to hear from everybody.
Awesome.
Thank
Justin,
you so much.
thanks so much. Thanks, Ramin. Great
Thank you.
conversation, guys, and let's continue to secure the future together. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating.